Hello, this is Daniel Alpine, animation historian, and welcome to the first episode of Animation Memory Lane, in which I talk about certain films on their anniversaries. To start the series, I thought it would be excellent to talk about one of the most significant animated films ever produced, which is Disney's 32nd animated feature film, The Lion King. The film was released today, 30 years ago. It's hard to believe it's that long, but it's even harder to believe that all the trouble the film went through during its production. A few people would naively think that the idea for an animated film and the process would be that an animator or even an executive woke up in the middle of the night and said, Lion King, let's produce it. And the script is written, and the animators draw a lot of drawings, and it's time for the premiere. But that does not happen at all. And it did not happen for The Lion King, actually. The idea that sparked it was during a flight to Europe that the three key executives at Disney, which were Chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg, Vice President Peter Schneider, and Vice Chairman Roy E. Disney. It was a flight to Europe to market the new animated film Oliver and Company. During the flight, a discussion was occurred about future projects, and one of the ideas was setting a new animated film in the country of Africa. And Jeffrey Katzenberg thought that was an excellent idea, and it started once the three returned to the US, it was put into development. What's also hard to believe is that the film, when it started, was very different in terms of the story and characters, and even the title. The film had different titles during its pre-production, including King of the Jungle. And initially, the director of the film was George Scribner, who had recently directed Oliver and Company, and Roger Allers, a story artist that recently was the head of story on Beauty and the Beast, was brought in to also direct. The early version of the film was very different, in which that the story was centered on a war between baboons and lions, and Scar was the leader of the baboons. And the film was more sort of similar to a nature documentary, and it was not a musical at all. And even though George was sort of passionate about this vision of the film, Roger didn't really see that this was working. It was not really his style of directing. It was soon thought that perhaps to add a little more substance to this was to make it into a musical, because, well, that's what Disney did at that time, musicals. And since Tim Rice was brought in because he was working on Aladdin at that time, and he suggested to for a collaborator to write the music was none other than rock artist Elton John. And after talking on the phone with Elton about bringing his style of music to the film, well, he signed on, and this did cause a little trouble with George because he didn't really think that this film could be a musical, and he left. He left the production. And while Roger Allers still was on to direct, other animator and story artist Rob Minkoff was brought in to also direct. And it was thought that the early version was not really working because it lacked a real central theme. And it was thought that what drove the idea that Jeffrey had in mind, which was the theme of growing up and accepting our responsibility and our place in the circle of life. What also was unusual about this film was that this was an original story. it was out of the blue and there was no real source material to look at. But as in the case of certain original stories, certain sources were looked to for for certain inspirations. Early on, it was thought that this could be sort of Bambi in Africa because they're both animal stories and both deal with the circle of life as the theme. But for this, other sources were looked after. One that people think at first is Shakespeare's Hamlet, because both feature the protagonist is a prince, the villain is his uncle, and his uncle kills his father. There was also other sources, which include the biblical stories of Joseph and Moses, which include the idea of a jealous relative that banishes the prodigal son, if you will, and he returns and is not recognized at first. And even the scene of Mufasa's ghost is it can be seen as a direct influence from the story of Moses, where Moses sees the burning bush and listens to the voice of God and is given wisdom and his mission. That's a lot of deep stuff that you wouldn't expect from an animated film, and it does have a real range because the central issue of the film is Simba's relationship with his father, and also Simba dealing with the death of his father. And really, but the theme that everyone can identify with is that we all have to fill our father's shoes at some point in our lives. While that all sounds excellent and does, looking back, sounds to be the key source for an excellent movie, still people at Disney did not believe in this movie at all. A lot of the executives, in particular Jeffrey Katzenberg, thought that the other film that was in production at that time, Pocahontas, was the real success in this because it seemed to have followed the paths of the previous films, Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast, and Lion King was completely different. And even marketing thought that consumer products didn't really think animals could work and that it was people that would sell, people characters. And a lot of the animators either had to be asked to work on the movie and even had to be begged to work on the movie, and a lot of the animation supervisors, this was their debut in that position because a lot were assistants to other animators on the previous films. Well, a few of the top animators, including Ruben Aquino and Mark Henn and Andreas Deja, were brought in. Still, for any animation students out there, one of the things that has to be learned is studying live action or real life. For Lion King, real animals were studied and even brought to the studio. That includes real lions and real hornbill birds, while others, which would be, the hyenas, where the animators had to look at documentaries because those are two unpredictable animals. And even a few of the key artists went on a trip to Africa to do research, to study the land, and also to sort of get a feeling of it. Even so, still, there was still the trouble that in January of 1994, 5 months before the film's premiere, the Northridge earthquake happened, and the studio had to be closed for a while, so the release date could not be pushed back. So the film for a while had to be done in the animators' houses, in their garages, until the studio could be open. after all that, and that, as you could think, the anticipation for this for fans in the audience was really high. But what changed the minds of the people at Disney was the teaser for the film that was released 6 months before its June 1994 release. The teaser was sort of different because what it was the opening scene, the Circle of Life song. It was to let people see what they're in store for in the next few months, and people really respond to it well and thought this was going to be an excellent film. Even toward the completion, still it was thought that this could be something special. The Lion King premiered on June 15th, 1994, at the El Capitan Theater in Los Angeles and at Radio City in New York. It was soon had its wide release on June 24th that year and would be a tremendous success. Critics were praising, well, every aspect of it, including the story, the songs, and the themes and the characters. And what do you know? The film would be the largest grossing film of 1994, and for 9 years, the largest grossing, well, animated film of all time, even Disney until, well, Frozen in 2013. And people would also view it as sort of the beginning of the end because the film was a huge success and the follow-up films up until, well, Tangled in 2010 didn't really match the success of The Lion King or the last two films, either critically or at the box office. As a 1990s kid that was born 1 month before the film's release, it was a privilege to have seen the film growing up, first on video, then later DVD, and seeing the musical adaptation on Broadway 2 times. It was also a privilege to have met a few of the key people that worked on it, including a story artist, character designer, and art director Chris Sanders, the animation supervisor of the Hyenas, Alex Cooperschmidt, and the animation supervisor of Young Simba, Mark Henn. And even after expanding the film into a franchise that included first a TV series starring the comedic sidekicks Timon and Pumbaa, and two direct-to-video sequels that, in contrast to the others that Disney produced, were actually considered good. And recently, a bad remake, and that will soon be followed a prequel to it. As one person on Cartoon Brew said, it's an unnecessary prequel to an unnecessary remake. Well, what can you do? That's Hollywood. Still, we all can still look back at the original and really, if you grew up watching it as I did or introducing your kids to it recently, well, let's all continue the story on and let's all, well, discover the circle of life. This is Daniel Alpine. Remember to give a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.